He tells quite a tale. I consent, so I guess I got to say, got it here.
You're
Okay.
I
Hello,
consent, so I guess I got to say, got it here.
Okay, we're just in the middle of preparing everyone. Sorry. We had a slight technical hitch, so we've just resolved that happily. My name is Paul Reynolds. I'm a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, and good evening if you're in Europe. Good afternoon if you're in the States, and I suppose good morning if you're in Australasia. And welcome to this broadcast. Historical Materialism broadcasts seek to promote both historical materialism books and journal, but they also like to promote some of the best and most original and cutting-edge thinking that's coming out in Marxist and Marxist circles. Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler's book, False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, would certainly fit into that characterization. And this is the first of two sessions. The second one next Friday night with the same panel. And the second one is on the second book, which is the philosophical and political consequences of the critique of political economy, recognizing capital. But this is on the first one, False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory. Okay, so who we have with us? Well, we're delighted to have Patrick and Jeanne here to present around their book. And we have three stellar commentators to actually give us their views on the book. And then, of course, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel. Just to give brief introductions, Patrick Kelly is John C. Kennefick Faculty Chair in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Crichton University. And for anybody who's ever read any form of Marxist philosophical political economy, Patrick is very well known and needs no further introduction. Jeanne Schuler is Professor of Philosophy at Crichton University, Omaha, Nebraska, and she's published extensively on the history of philosophy and critical theory. And moving to our panel, Ruth Groff is Associate Professor of Political Science and affiliated faculty with the Department of Philosophy at St. Louis University. She's written extensively on philosophical issues around metaphysics, causal power, and critical realism. Then we have Tony Smith, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Political Science at Iowa State University, and the author of a number of books, including Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, Globalization and Systematic Marxian Account, and Technology and Capital in the Age of Lean Production, a Marxian Critique of the New Economy. And finally, last but certainly not least, Tom Jeannot, who is Professor of Philosophy at Gonzaga University, Spokane in Washington, and his publications include Personalism, Atheism, and Marxist Humanism. If you want to read the biographies of these people, and you should, it's on the Eventbrite page advertising this and goes to some length. But I would rather not waste our time listening to me. I would rather you listen to the people who matter. So I'm delighted to hand over first to Patrick and Jeanne.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. So we'd like to begin by thanking you and the Historical Materialism Journal for taking the initiative to have these sessions on the two books. And we want to thank our three panelists here, Tony Smith, Ruth Groff, and Tom Jeannot, and all of you who are watching. So thank you. Just a note, on the site for the book at Springer Link, you can, for free, download the front matter and the back matter. And the front matter includes the preface, which is dense and give you an idea of what's going on in the book. And then there's two appendices in the back matter on dogmas of factoring philosophy and symptoms of factoring philosophy. So you can download those as PDFs. So, Jeanne.
I'd say there's two main sources for this book. One is teaching philosophy for many years and finding in the work of philosophy some sources of frustration about the kind of thinking that is mainstream philosophy, finding sort of the arguments for egoism, subjectivity of values, absurdity of life, and through the years, seeing patterns in how these topics are addressed and feeling the inadequacy of how these topics are addressed. And also, I'd say looking out at the world and feeling that philosophy is by really not much of a player in the world, and connecting the sort of bystander relation of philosophy to the world with the poverty of some of these issues and concepts that sort of are our focus. And the sources, when we were formed as thinkers, the pattern that we're seeing in how so much philosophy is done reminds us of Verstand thinking. And the sources for us were really many, but in particular, Hegel and Marx and Heidegger. And so this Verstand pattern that you see where these bifurcations are set up, egoism, altruism, and they sort of set the terms of discourse, freedom and determinism, finite and infinite, mind and body. And the importance of moving beyond the Verstand. Hegel says you got to begin with the Verstand. It's important. It sheds some light. But these bifurcations, when you pay attention to them, you're brought into questions and doubts. How do you really separate them and make sense of the world? The shortcomings of this initial phase of thinking a topic through come to light. And what I think so often happens is that he calls this period like dialectic, when the doubts and the questions and the sometimes outright confusion comes when you question the dichotomies. Sometimes philosophy doesn't get beyond that. It gets stuck there. Hegel says if you stay in the dialectic, you get stuck in skepticism. That is, you just figure there's really no way forward. You can just be stuck with the impassable opposition. Or you can move towards sophistry. So the sophist is the person who just kind of moves back and forth from one position to another, is clever, is entertaining, and is not able to move beyond the opposition, isn't able to question it. And for Hegel, the real good concepts arise through the thinking through the oppositions. And good concepts we feel are in short order in our universities. Our students might be bringing in, opportunity costs into their ethics papers, because these are the concepts that they're learning about how to make sense out of the world, or neoliberalism, feminism, or so our sources have sort of allowed us to see that there's something beyond just Verstand kind of philosophy. And these concepts are, we'd call them impoverished. Sometimes they're worse than impoverished. Sometimes they're just plain old pseudo concepts. But when you get to a good concept, when you get to a kind of enfleshed consciousness, or when you get to a real embodied freedom, they have a very different impact on human beings. They're sustaining. Good concepts are sustaining. I would say they shed light. They help you ask questions. They help you go deeper. And so one of the sources for this book is to try and criticize the dichotomies, which I think is the work of the dialectic, and then to point in the direction of the more embodied and deeper concepts. And we realize that philosophy typically focuses on propositions and not on concepts. And we're convinced, because of our sources, that the basic concepts are really important. Don't just assume their meaning. They have to be developed and worked through. And when you arrive at them, they're very different from the dichotomies you start with. And just briefly, the phenomenological source, one of our colleagues made us teach being in time. So we had to teach being in time. And through the years of teaching being in time in our senior exit course, we have come to appreciate the resources there for addressing how is it that we arrive at this kind of skewed factoring philosophy when we don't pay attention to fundamental phenomenological features of human life, and we split apart what belongs together. If you read Heidegger, you know, you don't split them apart. You because we're a being in the world, we're a being with others, we're a being that has a horizon on the world, we're a being that uses things, that we're a being whose mood and understanding and discourse, they're all constituting what it means to be human. And if you break it apart and separate it out and try to make sense of language or the individual without keeping that sort of hyphenated complexity in mind, you end up with grotesques, not with humans.
So maybe we could address a couple of questions that come to mind, like what are false moves? What is factoring philosophy? And what criticism on that? So what Jeanne is just talking about, so false moves could be described as phenomenological mistakes. So what's phenomenology for us? We're not, steeped in phenomenology. There's a lot of literature of that. We're using it in a fairly simple way to say experience-based inquiry into the question of when you can make a distinction. Are these things that are just distinguishable analytically, or are they separable? And factoring philosophy is not attuned to that. So factoring philosophy makes phenomenological mistakes by treating things where you can make a distinction, but they're not really separable. And those are, so the false moves are really phenomenological mistakes. We also talk about purist splits, bad abstractions, and that's sort of the heart of the thing. So as the chapters are covering a lot of different topics, and they all really kind of come back to the false moves, to the phenomenological mistakes, the bad abstractions, where you treat things as separable that aren't. So there's, I would say, two really big ones in the course of the book. One is separating the subjective from the objective, mind from world, and treating these as, in a purist kind of way, pure subjectivity, pure objectivity. That is a big one. That sets up the subjectivity of values. That sets up a kind of global skepticism in terms of knowledge. And the other one, which takes us more into Marx and the kind of social sphere, would be the splitting apart of needs, wealth, labor, and production from their constitutive social forms and purposes, leaving what we call the illusion of the economic, as if there was some kind of economy, as if there were needs and wealth and labor processes in general. And that's the source of a great number of problems. But maybe you want to say something about the skepticism.
Okay, yeah, so much philosophy factors. By that I mean so much philosophy is asking, well, what's the origin of this? Is it something that comes from the mind, or is it something that comes from the world? And that demarcation is at the root of bad concepts. It pushes us as it pushed Kant, the brilliant Kant, all respect for Kant, but that insistence on sort of what do we contribute and bring as thinkers, and what comes to us from the world, from the thing itself, that demarcation will lead to Kant's conclusion that we know how the world appears to us with necessity and universality. So he's not a skeptic that we can't have knowledge, but he is a skeptic about saying that the knowledge we have is the knowledge of how things are in the world. The knowledge we have, says Kant, is the knowledge of how the world appears to our mode of sensing and mode of thinking. Why is that wrong? Hegel says this. He says, we have a desire for truth that is just part of who we are. And when we are told, well, we know how things appear to our mode of consciousness, to our mode of thinking, but change the mode of consciousness and you'll change how things appear. From Hegel's point of view, that's not enough to sort of satisfy the desire for getting to what things are. And his response, so in other words, skepticism is pretty much, Descartes is, I don't think of Descartes as a skeptic, but by the end of modern philosophy, as the Enlightenment's winding down, you are brought to the skepticism of the critical project, and so the critique of the Enlightenment from Hegel's point of view begins with this fundamental demand that if you separate the subject from the object, you will never get to the object. You cannot. And so Hegel's, in many ways, when he begins with natural consciousness and the phenomenology, is always has an object. But it's I don't think of that as the intentionality of Heidegger's role. I think of that object of consciousness as more like Heidegger. You're always in the world. When we're wrong about something, we're in the wrong world. When we doubt the world, we're in the world. It's the being in the world, consciousness having an object is a fundamental condition of all forms of knowledge. And at the end of the day, it allows us, I don't like the word absolute, but it allows us to come to an understanding of what it is to be true that's not true for us, that's just true.
I think what one of the things we're working on is a phrase, the epistemic Midas touch, and I think this is what's happened, and that leads to the global skepticism is you start realizing that in the effort to know the world, we're involved. Okay, we're involved with language, we're involved with conceptualization and so forth, and then you start reflecting on that, and you make the false move of treating that as something that's purely subjective, and then the question, and then you get into the epistemic Midas touches with, as soon as we try to know something, we're falsifying it. This is what Hegel really, in the introduction to the phenomenology, this is precisely the problem he tries to respond to. Donald Davidson, I think, is responding to that in his famous article on the very idea of a conceptual scheme. And so that kind of picture of the purely subjective really leads us into a kind of global skepticism. I want to talk about the last three chapters of the book, which deal with wealth, utility, and instrumental reason. The structure of that comes in part from the appendix of Tony Smith's book, The Logic of Marx's Capital, where he criticizes three alternatives to Marxian value theory. And we sort of take those back into three concepts. So wealth, that you're where you're making wealth in general as a fundamental concept, utility, a second one, and then instrumental reason and action as a third. And Tony's point in the appendix is all of these are inferior to Marxian value theory. Well, we're agreed on that, but what we want to say in these three chapters, what we're arguing for is that wealth in general, utility, and instrumental reason and action are actually worse than that. They're all really pseudo concepts, and they're all really rooted in the illusion of the economic, as if there was something as if there was some kind of economy in general where there just weren't any social bonds. See, that's the false move, is splitting off production, wealth, labor from constitutive social forms, and then what have you got? Then you've got this kind of empty thing, which cannot exist, of course. So the big insight, I think, of Marx's historical materialism is that there's always a mode of production, and a mode of production is always a way of life. So it's going to be very thick with moral, social, political, juridical implications. And when you fall into the illusion of the economic and you think that there's something like an economy in general, right? Sam Chambers wrote a book called "There Is No Such Thing as the Economy." Yeah, that's it. Then it's the road to positivism, among other things, because then you think like there's a sphere of social life where, people are working, they're doing instrumental action, but what are they? Wage laborers? Are they enslaved people? Are they serfs or what? You think, and this really leads to a fundamental critique of mainstream economics, which really presents itself as if it was talking about an economy in general, but there isn't any. So it's missing the object of its own investigation, which leads it to bait and switch. So immediately it'll bring in, you read a microeconomics book, immediately it will bring in all the familiar, private property is there, money, prices, wages, profits, and so forth. But it pretends to be some kind of generally applicable social science.
I know we're supposed to shut up, but just one more thing I think is important, which is what we think about for years. Why is there such an attraction to bad ideas in the world? It's just so easy to teach the subjectivity of values. It's so hard to teach that there's good in things, that there's the good in the apple, as opposed to, well, no, it's how you feel about it. And I'm seeing the links with capitalism has kind of convinced me that this, the tremendous power that's being part of the human species, which is so cut short because of the kind of ideas people live with that are just not adequate to making sense out of, sitting at a table in front of a window, the basic issues, let alone the big global issues, is because I think there's a real way in which our world of ideas is sort of shaped to keep us from thinking about the world. Well, it's sort of a powerful form of disguise, so that you don't ask questions that would be hard to answer, maybe, but would be taking you into the world. You'd have debates and you go back and forth, altruism, egoism, but they don't take you into the world. And I think the sort of poverty of the intellectual world, or at least the mainstream intellectual world, is really directed at maintaining the status quo and not allowing people to develop a critical mindedness. Anyway,
and just to highlight two concepts that are missing, value and capital, which are sort of at the crux. So all of this leads to an idea that social theory is like really set back. So one of the things that maybe we want to frame this, I meant to frame this at the beginning, we'll frame it at the end, is Marx talks about the bourgeois horizon. In talking about Proudhon, who's in the Poverty of Philosophy, who's simultaneously kind of doing his own version of Hegelian philosophy and his own version of kind of more classical political economy. And Marx, in a letter to Annenkopf, says he doesn't escape the bourgeois horizon. So factoring philosophy creates the bourgeois horizon. So really, this whole book could be thought of as a kind of exploration into what Marx is talking about as the bourgeois horizon. So
yeah,
maybe we'll wrap there.
I can't hear Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. I'll just say before I bring in, I think it's Tony next. For those of you who had a brief hiatus at the beginning, we are broadcasting on a different URL. I've put it in the chat box of your YouTube, and I see everybody's migrated. But if you missed the first couple of minutes, which was simply me waffling an introduction, this will remain on YouTube when we finish, so you'll be able to watch it again and again and again and again. Okay, Tony.
All right. Well, this is an incredibly rich book, and there's no possible way I can do it justice in 10 minutes. So I just want to talk about some of the themes in it that I think would be of special interest to historical materialist readers who aren't necessarily interested in philosophy or committed to philosophy as a project. It seems to me that there are a bunch of mistakes that get made all over the place. if you think of them on the model of a virus that just sort of spread, this book is an inoculation against some very important types of viruses of the mind. And I think that's the best way to think about it. And it's an effective virus because it's written so clearly, and it can talk about really deep philosophical issues in a way that is of interest to professional philosophers, but really should be accessible to basically anyone who reads theoretical literature of any sort. It's really the most effective virus protection against some of these viruses I've ever read in many ways. So the first virus is one that was already stressed so much in their presentation. It's the splitting of the subject and the object, right? So if you split the subject and the object, you can make two sorts of mistakes that are made all the time. If you put too much stress on the object, you're going to get scientism, you're going to get positivism, you're going to get reductionism. Now, the book is implicitly critiques of those positions, but it really spends most of its time on talking about what happens with the overemphasis of the subject, where the subject is lost inside itself and loses touch with the world. And the problem there, of course, is that we have to give up a concept of truth. Right? If we're locked in our own heads, whether subjectively, intersubjectively, as a culture, whatever, if we can't ever get to the world, then we have to be skeptical about truth claims. Well, that's devastating for historical materialism as a project, because Marx's claim was that his system of the essential determinations of the capitalist mode of production captures the truth of the capitalist mode of production. So if you're going to give up a strong concept of truth, you don't have historical materialism anymore. The other problem is if you're lost inside of our subjectivity, and that means that all values are subjective ultimately, then we can't talk about goodness in the world. We can't talk about the lack of goodness in the world. And if you give that up, you're going to give up the critique that is in historical materialism. You can't say there's some big problem with capitalism because it doesn't allow human flourishing, and human flourishing is good. And it does generate unnecessary human suffering, and human suffering is bad. And if you give that up, you're giving up historical materialism. And if we're lost inside our own subjectivity, then the need to act in the world is pointless. And so you're stuck in stoicism, where what matters is your own inner world of your inner subjectivity. Well, if historical materialism isn't about praxis to transform the world, then what is it about? Right? If we're lost in the Stoic position, then we've given up historical materialism. So these philosophical discussions that Patrick and Jeanne have of Stoicism and skepticism and so on, it's not like they're irrelevant to historical materialism. They go right to the heart of the historical materialist project. Another virus, from my point of view, this is a little more trivial maybe, but another virus is the misunderstanding of Hegel. And it's easy to say Hegel talks about absolute thought, and this is some crazy form of idealism, so we don't have anything to learn from here, and he's our big enemy. And I think that some of the best stuff about Hegel I've ever read is in this book. This book brings out really, really clearly that that is a fundamental misunderstanding of Hegel's project, that Hegel's project is simply based on the idea, not that the world doesn't have being independent from my being as an individual subject or our being as a subjective community. The world has being of its own, but the world is intelligible. The world is intelligible, and we grasp that intelligibility not passively. It takes active thinking, and our active thinking informing concepts. The whole point of it is not to stay distant from the world, but to grasp the intelligibility of the world. And when we do grasp the intelligibility of the world to the extent that we can, there is a unity of subject and object in their difference, right? Not a removal of the object, but a unity in the difference. And again, this is a claim of historical materialism. Once again, the claim of historical materialism is Marx's system of categories, the essential determinations of the capitalist mode of production. It really does capture what capitalism is, right? So there is, in that sense, a unity of thought and object in their difference. So Jeanne made a reference to the scary word absolute, but insofar as Marx was right that this system of categories helps us comprehend what capitalism is, then Marxist thinking was an absolute type of thinking in Hegel's sense of the term. It's an unusual sense of the term, but I think that's the right reading of Hegel, and you don't see it presented very often, and you don't ever see it presented as clearly and as forcefully as it's presented in this book. The third thing that I think is of unbelievable importance is the critique of nominalism. Now, nominalism is probably a term that most non-philosophers don't ever come across. It basically is the idea that all abstractions are fictions, right? That what the world gives to us is a jumble of separate things, and then we try to organize them by coming up with some abstract organizational schema that's basically a fiction, and maybe it's useful, hopefully it helps us survive, but it doesn't, again, get us to the way things are. Now, concept that is the reason why it's important to critique nominalism, was stressed again by Jeanne and Patrick. Marxist theory is all about social form, right? It's all about that capitalism isn't really just a jumble of different things. It's not a jumble of random acts that people do. It's not a bunch of individuals trying to pursue their private self-interest as best they can and bumping into others, right? It's a world that is formed. And so the forms are abstractions. Now, again, we call them real abstractions, but the basic point holds, right? The world isn't a world of separate things that don't have anything to do with each other. The world comes as formed. And if you can't grasp those forms, then you can't do Marx's project. And again, this book is a brilliant argument against nominalism and for the need to think in terms of the world as formed. It's an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle and so on, but it's one that Marx totally accepted and needed. The fourth point I want to stress is hinted at again by Patrick. It's the critique of utility. Devastating critique. The concept of utility is a virus that permeates all social science, right? Utilitarianism, neoclassical theory, neoliberal theory, most political science, most sociology, rational choice theory, it's everywhere. And they brilliantly show and clearly show that philosophically, it's a nothingness. It's an empty, void, meaningless concept, right? Because, and this is again related to the critique of nominalism, we don't just have all these pleasures that are all sort of the same thing that we can lump together. We don't have all sorts of preferences that are the same sort of thing that we can just sort of lump together. They come as formed, right? So pleasure is always a pleasure of something, the pleasure of friendship, the pleasure of culture, whatever. So the whole project of utility is to take qualitatively heterogeneous types of pleasure and preferences and treat them as if they were all homogeneous, so that we can treat them as quantities that we can just add up and compare to each other. Well, that is a ludicrous project that from a philosophical standpoint doesn't get to the first stage, right? It's corrupt from the beginning. So but it's so useful for capitalism that instead of talking about money and prices and the endless drive to accumulate, we can talk about systems that maximize people's preferences. Well, that's a nice way to, I mean, that really helps capitalism a lot if we talk that way, but it's fundamentally philosophically bankrupt. And so what Patrick and Jeanne have done is just unmask the bankruptcy of that concept. And then the final point I want to stress is in some ways the most important, although maybe it makes more sense to wait till next week to talk about it, is their concept of capital. And again, the concept of capital is at the heart of Marx. It's a complex concept. If you want to understand it, there just aren't clearer, simpler, more straightforward, more powerful descriptions of that concept than what you will find in this book. And basically, today we talk about capital all over the place, human capital, cultural capital, social capital, political capital. It's so used so often, it's become a meaningless concept. And that's a virus, right? When we think of it as a meaningless concept. And this book is an inoculation against that virus, right? The key idea that gets stressed a lot, a mode of production is a mode of life. A mode of production is a mode of life. What's the capitalist mode of production? It's about organizing production and distribution based on the valorization imperative. M must become M prime. The amount of money that you invest in production, you must end up with more money at the end of it, or everything falls apart. And you must do whatever that must happen. That mode of production becomes a mode of life because everybody needs money in order to survive in a generalized commodity system. And in order to get money, you have to go somehow relate, whether it's an owner or a worker or a pension achiever or whatever, to the production of money, the accumulation of money. So we live in a social world where capital, it's been generated by our social relations, but once it's generated, it has this power of an impersonal force over us, subjecting all of us in our everyday life as a mode of life everywhere to this imperative: M must become M prime. And so family life is limited and distorted by the capital imperative. Community life is limited and distorted by the capital imperative. Political life is certainly limited and distorted by the capital imperative. And yet the capital imperative is invisible to us. We don't see capital. We talk about human capital, social capital, community capital, but we don't see capital as this impersonal power over our lives. If you read this book, you will see it, and you will be inoculated against the virus of having it be invisible forever, right? So these are tremendous contributions. These are tremendous contributions. Do I have more time, or should I? Yeah. Just for the sake of discussion, I'll throw out a couple of questions that I had when I read the book. Let me just make sure I have them here. Okay, so one question is just this concept of the stress on factoring, the stress on the purist impulse. That obviously fits for a lot of the issues that you talk about, right? For one of the main issues, though, I don't quite see how it fits so easily. So we have this main point here about capital. What I'm just trying to say here is, it seems to me there's something different. The critique of capital doesn't quite fit in the same paradigm as the critique of putting too much emphasis on the subject at the cost of the object, or too much emphasis on the object pull at the cost of the subject. It seems in those cases we have an experience. We have experience, and we all understand what it means to talk about the subject, what it talks about the object, and then we have this purist impulse to try to only talk about one and not talk about the other, reduce one to the other or whatever. But the case about capital is invisible, right? We don't see, it's not like we have a unified experience of two different things, and we can't see how they're connected. We can't see one of them. It's invisible to us. So it seems a slightly different, or it seems a very much different to me, problem than the factoring problem. It's a thing not uniting two things that are inherently united. We don't see how capitalism is really different from every other type of society that's ever been. If that makes any sense. So that's one question I had. Second question I had is just this concept that has been raised by Patrick, I think, the bourgeois horizon. You talk a lot about Stoicism, you talk a lot about skepticism. Well, these are phenomenon from Hellenistic Greece, ancient Rome. These were commercial societies in some sense. They had active markets and all that, but they weren't market societies. It also seems to me that some of these issues that you talk about come up in societies that are even a lot less commercial than Rome and Greece were, like the inner-outer distinction. The soul-body distinction, I think, goes back. I mean, people talked about souls leaving bodies and going off elsewhere. My understanding is, right, mythical times, that's like a common mythical motif. So there's nothing, it's hard for me to see anything specifically part of a bourgeois horizon in some of these categories. Now, in other categories, sure, right? Utilitarianism, definitely bourgeois horizon. Productivism, definitely bourgeois horizon. But some of the ones don't seem to fit quite so easily. And then these are all big cans of worms that we won't have time to talk about. But the other big question I had from this book is just this priority of the right over the good, which is a big question in liberal philosophy. And you are 100% right that contemporary liberal philosophy is completely bankrupt because it tries to talk about a society that is neutral about the good when it's completely subjected to capital's good. And that's a devastating critique of liberal philosophy, and I'm with it 100%. On the other hand, it does seem to me there's something right about a priority of the right over a comprehensive theory of the good. Because it seems to me the big political dangers today are all comprehensive theories of the good, right? Ethno-nationalism in our country, theodicy, turn to theocratic regimes and so on. It seems to me we do need something that puts solidarity before a comprehensive theory of the good that would exclude granting solidarity. And it's hard for me to think about solidarity in terms of not building in everybody having substantive rights to freedom and equality as like a starting point of political theory. So in that sense, it seems to me the starting point of political theory has to be, I guess I'm a Rawlsian on this one point, right? Has to be a theory of solidarity that gets fleshed out in terms of a theory of rights, and a thin theory of the good, maybe thicker than Rawls's, but still thin compared to like a thick, comprehensive theory of the good. So I wonder if you agree with that or disagree with that. I'm sure I've exhausted my time at this point. It's a wonderful book, though, and whatever things we can, like all of the books, it raises as many questions as it answers, but the questions and answers are really, really important.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. Over to you, Ruth. Ruth, you're muted. If you just unmute.
Yeah,
be
sorry, I'm muted. I at least I'm consistent. I do that every single time. So thanks very much for the invitation. And delighted to be here and had sort of faced the same kind of problem of what can you say in 10 minutes? It seems like either you can't say anything or you have to say everything. Probably, Tony, I really appreciated your kind of inflection for people whose orientation might be political economy. I think probably I haven't managed to do that. So my mine's more for the metaphysicians in the crowd. But I too thought, well, I've got four things, and but I thought, well, 10 minutes is enough to say 2.5 minutes on each thing. So but I didn't distribute the time equally. So, so the first thing I want to say is this book is a tour de force. Kuntz, I just stop there, but it's a tour de force. Second of all, I love the kind of work that it is. Well, no. 2A, this is not only is it a paradigm of a tour de force, it's a paradigm of radical philosophy in the sense that it's an effort to get to the very deepest level and to show how a problem or set of problems at the deepest level drives other problems in other areas or other problems at other levels of abstraction. So I want to note that it is that kind of work, and also to say I personally love that kind of work. It's not that common. I think it really is important. Not that I have written something like this, but I was just reminded that when I wrote a paper once called "The Devil is in the Categories." And I think like I say that just to say like, I am all in with this kind of work that's radical in this kind of way. Patrick mentioned when he was talking that like two concepts that we don't, that don't show up in the vocabulary because of the way things are structured conceptually because of the architecture, or he just happened to mention capital and value. And it's like, hey, we can't talk about these. I would add other ones. We can't talk about real causal powers. I mean, nowadays, a little tiny bit you can if you're, if you're happen to be in philosophy and not in social science. But we can't talk about real causal powers, and we certainly can't talk about non-reducible collectivities, let alone ones like, say, collective bargaining units that you might think have real causal powers and don't just exhibit, in relation to which one might just have the same reaction every time one encounters one, right? So those are just a couple more concepts that the current dominant architecture excludes. And I love this book as a kind of book, and a kind of philosophy, the project of which is to get to the bottom layer of the foundational layer of the conceptual architecture and show how it's going to be wrong everywhere if it's wrong over here. For me, the two thinkers that really came to mind, one is Charles Taylor, of course, without the involvement of and application to Marx, but all of his early articles in particular, and even up into the collected articles in the 90s, are very much in the same spirit, and even indeed informed by some of the same sources and talking about some of the same mistakes. And I was very struck by that. And he's, what a shock, one of my favorite thinkers. And the other one is MacIntyre, who in a really different kind of way, there's so much similarity here, especially in employing the very concept of a false or empty concept, which he didn't make up either, but also in the actual ones. So I'm thinking of after virtue in particular, I mean, Tony, you might have a fight with him about it. He thinks the concept of a right is just like a fake, phony thing, but he certainly goes after utility also in a similar sort of way, and at least in a limiting case is telling us that post-Enlightenment problems are ones that are artifacts of the loss of a certain conceptual and accompanying social structure that would preclude the asking of those questions. And so I was really struck by the similarities between this work and those works. And that's just yet another way of saying, I love it. And it's like some of my most favorite thinkers in those regards. I really agree with many of the applications, and I would say especially, applications of the correction of false moves, especially the overtly social and the kind of ones at the social level, where we can see how either an analytic distinction treated as a real distinction yields empty concepts or is obfuscatory, or similarly where we see how a generalization is treated as a concrete reality. So I really agreed with many of those. I was like, yes, yes, yes. Okay, so that said, then I'll say similarly, like some differences. Do I? Oh, great. Okay, so I have a little bit of time. So one is that I absolutely agree that the following two mistakes are mistakes. So the one is the one you guys lead with, the confusion of what I would call an analytic distinction with a real distinction. And that's seems to drive even the term of factoring philosophy, et cetera. And I think, that's a real problem. And I totally agree that you've identified it. I love your thing about parts versus aspects. I was saying to Patrick that Jonathan Lowe held that view even about Aristotelian hylomorphism, that, form and matter aren't parts, right? They're not proper parts. They're aspects of any material informed thing. So I love that. And I also love the issue of confusing a general abstraction with a concrete determined particular. To my mind, there's some ambiguity in the book, or equivocation. I don't know if equivocation sounds too mean or too intentional, but there's some ambiguity about whether either or both of these is like the root false move from which the others come, or whether either or both of them are elements of a set of false moves called factoring philosophy. I think there's an impulse to have the analytic versus real thing really ground everything else, but in practice, it seems to me like it's not so clear that it actually is driving the analysis everywhere. Yeah, the second point, not very substantive, just some of the particular extensions or applications I didn't agree with, but that's fine, but I loved some of the other ones. Probably more substantive is another distinction that you make that at times it sounds like you want to have be the crucial one that's going to drive all the other mistakes, is a distinction between world and mind. And you want to say, like, that's a bad distinction, right? We can't distinguish between these things. And I think I want to go even further and say, like, I don't even like them as analytic categories. Like, I think mind is a pseudo concept. Like, I don't even like world or mind. I mean, world versus mind, and now we've got a problem because world and mind have been separated. And I want to say, but something like, yeah, world is a real thing, but mind, that's not, I want to say, no, there are some living substances that are sentient in the world. But that doesn't quite, that's not the resolution that you're pushing for. And so that very distinction, I feel like that one is one that got me and made me feel like, for me, because I'm probably more of an unreconstructed realist in a way, is that that's an instance where there's maybe not quite enough distinction between epistemology and ontology. Now, you're going to probably say the very urge to separate them is part of what we're calling the problem, but I guess I see it, I think you can address that and see it differently. So I was a little nervous. And the final point, which relates to that, is that I wonder if a vision of a kind of thoroughly commingled world and mind that wouldn't be factored out, where they're aspects of the same thing. I wonder if that ontology is one that you're only gonna go for if you are coming out of a tradition of a certain kind of objective idealism, namely Hegel or Spinoza. I don't know Heidegger so well, but Hegel and Spinoza both, I think, invite us to solve this false dichotomy by imagining a world that's saturated with mind in a way that you can't pull them apart. But I feel like without making a false move, I can say, no, some parts of the world are saturated with mind and other parts aren't. And as a matter of ontology, but of course, when I know the parts that maybe aren't saturated with mind, that's an act of knowing of an embodied subject. So that's different. But I think, yeah, so those are some of my like big picture reservations, like Tony threw out at the end. But it's a great book. It's absolutely a tour de force, and people should read it.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruth. It's always a point, isn't it, when somebody says it's a great book, but But
The great book
Tom,
and
Tom, you're muted, Tom. I'm sure you're better with sound.
Maybe not, Paul. Let's stay tuned here. No, it's just such an honor and a pleasure and a treat to be in this company, and I can see that we're going to have plenty to talk about. I tend to wander off, so therefore, I thought I'd be best off pinning myself down with written remarks, and they might serve as a kind of coda uh, uh, to the remarks that have been made thus far. And I'm going to do a certain amount of quoting Murray and Schuler so that I don't stray too far from their text. For Murray and Schuler, philosophy is a two-dimensional kind of investigation. One dimension is analysis. In the other dimension, the necessary complement of analysis is just enough phenomenology. Analysis is conceptual analysis. It is typified by the dominant kind of philosophy in the English-speaking world, commonly called analytic philosophy. Murray and Schuler write, what is widely thought of as analytic philosophy is what we call factoring philosophy. They write that the terminology factoring philosophy offers an alternative to the persistent but elusive contrast between analytic and continental philosophy. It is a conceptually sharper term for classifying philosophical positions. Factoring cuts across the familiar categories of rationalism, empiricism, critical philosophy, and pragmatism. So Murray and Schuler write that whereas to reveal truth belongs to philosophy's aim, factoring undermines the discourse of truth and error, substitutes values for goods, and collapses the determinate categories needed for social theory. This is damning critique, but then again, the title of the book is False Moves. False moves are inevitable when conceptual analysis is untethered from its necessary complement, properly and rightly called phenomenology, by which Murray and Schuler mean, for those with adverse views of Hegel or Heidegger, for those put off by the term phenomenology, experience-based inquiry. Factoring philosophy is philosophy untethered from experience. Experience is also an elusive term, but Murray and Schuler are scrupulously dedicated to following Berkeley's advice. Yes, that Berkeley. They write, Berkeley's advice for thinking clearly is to hew closely to experience. Ideas that stay rooted in experience do not blind us. By contrast, philosophy stuck in skepticism has little to offer society. Instead, it presents dangers. Murray and Schuler characterized Kant as the factoring philosopher par excellence, who attempted to steer through the Scylla of Humean skepticism and the Charybdis of Wolffian dogmatism. But skepticism, they write, the seeming antithesis of dogmatism, is its flip side. Its roots are buried in dogmas. Once Kant concludes that the world as it is an unknowable ding on zig, the upshot is what we can call bourgeois agnosticism. Generalized agnosticism about everything Hegel called actuality, what is both real and rational, is in turn the ideal epistemological mate for capitalist society, which is a world in which there are only values, but nothing inherently and knowably good, beautiful, true, or just. I found one of the more difficult points to grasp from Murray and Schuler is the first of four tenets of false philosophy that chart the course of unconstrained analysis. The four tenets are as follows. 1, necessity cannot be known based on experience. 2, whatever is conceivable is possible. 3, the subjective and objective are separable. And 4, the epistemic activity of the knower is always falsified. From a loss of nerve on my part, I would have taken the first of these, necessity cannot be known based on experience, to be axiomatic. But Murray and Schuler's explanation of why this tenet is false is astonishingly simple in the physicist's sense of elegant and entirely straightforward. In their critique of Thomas Nagel's opinion that objectively considered life is absurd, they write, without experiencing what is necessary, we could not recognize what is arbitrary. To exclude necessity from experience would eliminate the arbitrary as well. Murray's and Schuler's explanation of experiencing, or rather formulation, of experiencing what is necessary brings us to the phenomenological heart of the matter. Phenomenology preeminently concerns the distinction between what is distinguishable on the one hand and what is separable on the other hand. For example, color and shape are distinct, but they are necessarily inseparable in that there are no colorless shapes nor shapeless colors. Hewing closely to experience, then, Murray and Schuler demonstrate that the same point goes for subjectivity and objectivity, certainly distinguishable, nevertheless inseparable. But factoring philosophy factors them out into pure subjectivity on the one hand and pure objectivity on the other hand. And this is what James Collins of St. Louis University, what James Collins calls a purist split. In fact, this bogus split between the purely subjective and the purely objective is the mother of all purist splits and consequent false moves. It is based on a defective phenomenology, which makes the mistaken phenomenological judgment that mind and world are separable. We were just talking about that. Our authors continue. When the foundational directions for knowing or acting are at odds with fundamental features of existence, false moves follow. The chief stumbling block addressed in their essays on losing public purpose is the presupposition of the separation of mind from world. The essay format of false moves facilitates Murray and Schuler's diagnosis of a series of basic mistakes in philosophy and social theory for the purpose of what they call conceptual healing in their preface. I'd like to go essay by essay, but I only had 10 minutes. So in conclusion, I'll say this. I teach at a small private university where hardly anyone majors in philosophy. Philosophy is required. The students are well-mannered and obedient. And I think for the most part, they appreciate and maybe even enjoy it. But I think they also understand, in the most ironic sense, that it's a field of study entirely without value, despite our market-based attempts to seduce them. This is partly a problem of capitalist society and the crisis in the humanities with which we're all familiar. But the discipline itself is also partly to blame. too often a protracted exercise in conceptual stalemates, reinforcing the purist split that the students have mastered as early as the third grade from the Common Core in American public education, namely the disjunction between fact and opinion. When philosophical conclusions are reduced to mere opinions, philosophy has indeed lost its public purpose.
Thanks very much, Tom. Okay, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the YouTube box, and I will pass them over to our panel. Certainly some very provocative thinking. If I can just indulge the chair for a moment, one of the things that struck me in reading some of the essays in False Moves was that it pointed out the essential fetishism of the way in which philosophy is engaged and tries to take the substance of philosophy, analysis, critique, away from the formality of philosophy. And it struck me that what they're talking about in a simple nutshell is this. We talk of philosophy as breeding life of the mind, but actually that's a seduction where life is low key and mind is high key. And what we want with a Marxist analysis is to look at life first and recognize mind is in the service of life, as critique and analysis should be. But just a rather banal observation there, while I'm letting both Patrick and Jeanne prepare to give some immediate responses. So over to you, Patrick and Jeanne.
Let me pick up, Tom, where you left off and do what you restrained yourself from doing, going through some of the chapters, because the subtitle of the book is Losing Public Purpose. And I was just, trying to think about that. And so here's some of the things that we're going up against. The beliefs, these kind of beliefs that come out of factoring philosophy, we argue. Number one, life is absurd. Death is nothing to fear since life is empty in the first place. What the Stoics call externals, which includes life itself, should be treated with indifference. Everyone's out for themselves. There's no moral luck or since responsibility extends no further than my intentions. Human action and responsibility are fraudulent ideas since human behavior belongs to the deterministic order of the universe. Political life should not orient itself to goods. All value, whether moral or aesthetic, is purely subjective. All our efforts at knowing are stymied by the Midas touch. Because our every effort at knowing is undone by the distortion that our subjectivity inescapably introduces. And this is quoting from a microeconomics book that is used here at our university. They have Glenn Hubbard is one of the co-authors, a very famous economist, and they have a list of important economic terms. So I always like to ask the question, how many of these terms are on that list? Private property, the commodity, money, price, value, profit, rent, interest, wages. None. Zero. Now, how is that going to, I don't think that's helpful to public purpose. So that list, to me, kind of going back with that thought of losing public purpose, these are all things that I think really sap or take the stuffings out of public purpose.
I'm wrestling with the not just the proliferation of capital to the point of humor, but what is it about the concept of capital that's so inaccessible to thinking? How something can be so abstract and so real and so powerful and not visible, except its effects are like gravity. Okay. and that this isn't really a problem of demarcation. This is it's a problem of a different order than demarcation. So I'm just kind of wrestling with how to identify. At one level, I'm thinking it's just the general reluctance to find necessity in the world, and as opposed to like what you choose to have be necessity, and have it all come back to the choices you make. It's value for me, it's not value for you. You just turn value into something that, like capital, has no meaning because it can mean anything. But also it's also the necessity of something that's very dynamic and very global. So it's not just abstract, socially necessary abstract labor, surplus value, realizing it, moving beyond market relations to production, and then into market relations, and then into the trade, the market, the realization of the surplus. I don't know what the words are to say why is that so out of reach, that that you can go through years and years of education and graduate with all sorts of degrees and not have almost anything to say about the meaning of capital. It's almost like a guarantee you won't have anything to say about the meaning of capital with our education. I just on the good, for me, I think I want to go heavy on the good, as in terms of the environmental planetary global crisis. That to me, what is uniting, I hope it's eventually, is the goods, that just existence of all sorts of creatures, Ruth, not just our species, but all the species. That the requirements for existence are what I would call the good. I do think right now the immediate target of Christian nationalism and the forms that the good is taking in terms of specifying is pretty scary. But I don't want to have the good be too minimal, because I think we need it. And just on the notion of mind in the world, I like this translation, spirit. I know it's pretty weird for a lot of people, Geist. But for me, Geist is almost like capital. It's an inherently complex concept because it won't let you split off the individual from the universal. It's historical. It's very conflicted. It requires lots of thinking to get at what Hegel means by spirit. And to me, that's not the kind of cogito inner mind that I think, when our students take philosophy of mind, I think they often have more of the consciousness of a Cartesian, as opposed to this Geist of Hegel, where we don't have to, get out of mind to get in the world, because you can never get into mind. You're always in the world. Just thoughts.
Yeah, Ruth, you brought in Alistair McIntyre, and he's certainly in our field of vision, very much so. And I think what we're trying to do is really root. So emotivism is really the bad thing for him, and I think what we're really trying to do, and this picks up on some things that you were saying earlier, is really get to the root of that, and really try to see that the kind of factoring philosophy that leads to the illusion of the economic creates a kind of positivist atmosphere where moral judgments are just opinions. You just these are your opinions. So we're trying to root it. He's talking about a breakdown of moral discourse. I think we're trying to talk about something that includes that, but is really a kind of breakdown of social theory that would include that, and the absence of the capital concept of capital. So Tony's your book, Beyond Liberal Egalitarian Liberalism. I mean, the crux of that book is like, here you've got all these in many ways very critical kind of liberal thinkers of different stripes, but none of them have the concept of capital, right? You mentioned Rawls, and I think you've given us something to think about with that, certainly. But Rawls, you have a whole book on justice, capital, value. They're just not there. But how is that? So in other words, we're really trying to kind of get at how has social theory been so deformed that the most important categories, they're just not there. So we in the chapter on why wealth is a poor concept, not a bad concept, because Ruth, you were talking about that this kind of problem that we get into, the move from it's okay to have a general concept of wealth or useful things, or a general concept of concrete labor, or Marx has a general concept of the labor process. Fine, but it's the fallacy is when you move from like a general concept of wealth to thinking that there's something like wealth in general, or a general, that you can say some things in general about the labor process, to thinking that there's a labor process in general. And he has some very sharp remarks against someone who he admired greatly, David Ricardo, about Ricardo is just obsessed with the collapsing of those two. That's a common thing that comes with the the illusion of the economic, is to really think that, capitalism really is the economy in general, but there's no such thing. And as I say, what economists do is at that point is just bait and switch, and they just, because you can't explain much of anything. This is Marx says, general categories are okay. They have a little place in science, but you can't explain much of anything when you limit yourself to those. So, yeah.
Okay. I'd like to bring in a couple of questions from the audience, but don't worry, panelists, there'll be plenty of time to be more critical. Okay asks whether Patrick and Jeanne, you can comment on the implications of their critique of false moves has for philosophy's role in the public sphere, politics, and political economy. So that's a very broad question. Andrew Lamas, who says it's a brilliant presentation, excellent discussion. My question, let's take the situation of a group of left-oriented people with a revolutionary disposition who are searching for a way to engage in radical praxis in a reactionary society. If these folks absorb Patrick and Jeanne's book, what kinds of projects would they consider that they are not likely already considering? Now, there's a challenging question. You want to respond to those immediately, Jeanne and Patrick, and then we might let the panel see if they want to add anything.
Or maybe they can go first. Good
idea.
Classic avoidance. That's what I like to say.
No,
I think there's a tremendous achievement that many people have who get educated in our system, and they go out and fight the good fight with lousy concepts. The people's actions and praxis are better than the concepts that they've been educated in. How many people, Ruth, are taking your course on Capital Volume 1 and then sort of absorbing and digesting these ideas so they can make the crossover into their own lives? So people are out there, in solidarity. I think it's amazing to me what is happening, to the degree that what kind of education do we have that promotes resistance, solidarity, kind of tough social movements? They are there, but so often I feel the concepts that are motivating them would be like Rawls, or would be like utilitarianism or something, which is, to me, is like, oh my gosh, how do you fill your, I'll say soul, I teach at a Jesuit school, how do you keep going with such lousy concepts because it's the right thing to do? So I think philosophy does have something to contribute to the world, because I think the deeper understanding of the issues before us, whether social in nature, personal, spiritual, the deeper understanding, the more adequate understanding is sustaining us for the long haul. And this is a long haul when we're facing. Tony?
Tony,
Well, just is that okay?
yeah.
Yeah, just on the concept of what this book might mean for activism and so on. In a longer term perspective, I think the book's helpful in thinking about what we want for socialism. I mean, the book is really good. I mean, it's the heart of the book is about how the problems arise when you get stuck in binaries and you pick one side rather than the other, instead of trying to see some sort of, if I can use the word, dialectical way of uniting these different moments that have to be conjoined. So, when we start thinking about what socialism is, I mean, there's a purism that will really push decentralization, and there's a purism that would really push centralization. And it just seems to me, if you pick either of those pluralisms, you're going to end in a dead end. And the big project is to try to figure out some way we can get the sort of decentralization we want and the type of centralization we want. You can go to a purism of socialism is all about autonomy. You can go to a purism where socialism is all about a centralized authority, or a purism of the individual choice being free and unrestricted, and the purism of a collective choice being imposed, or a purism of just trying to mobilize the tacit local knowledge, the flexibility that people have embodied as embodied, and then, or again, the sort of coherence of a planned way of living together in a community. And I mean, the big problem of capitalism has failed to put these things together completely. But as socialism, I think we have a challenge of trying to figure out how we can do everything we want at the same time. What sort of society would look like that would have enough centralization, but not too much, enough decentralization, but not too much, enough autonomy for individuals and groups, but not too much, enough central planning, but not too much. It's not been resolved yet. I don't think anybody's worked that out in a satisfactory way yet. But that does seem like the project. And I think thinking in the terms of this book of avoiding the temptation of purism is sort of a helpful general rule for socialists. It doesn't give us a magic wand to figure out the right answer, but it just gives us a sort of orientation to thinking about how to get towards the right answer.
Cool.
I think as we're academics, and to change, a book like this is, the hope is to kind of have some transformative effect on sort of the discourse that is out and about in academia, and hopefully in a wider kind of way. But a little bit more specifically, I think understanding what capital is and what I think is really an important part of understanding what a desirable post-capitalist world could involve. And I think one of the lessons here, and this goes back to the kind of recovery of the discourse of truth and falsity, but also the recovery of the discourse of goods, is I think a post-capitalist world has to have a different good or set of goods that are the targets, right? So the endless accumulation of capital, that's kind of the one we've got. And it's mediated, especially in the more social democratic capitalist societies. But it seems to me that that's one of the lessons, is that we have to substitute. There's always going to be a constitutive purpose, and if we want to get away from the constitutive purpose of endless capital accumulation, we need to have some other one, and that's going to require some serious thinking. And also, I mean, I think in a way, the history of decades and decades of social democracy, in a way, is a lived experiment with what are the things that are really important in life, and some of those things get decommodified. And so I think we have to kind of learn from that. But I think understanding that we're going to have an alternative organizing end is part of it. And it's not just a question of, right, for us, the crucial question, the question that Marx answers is a question that economics doesn't even recognize, which is, what's the social form of wealth? So the first sentence of Capital answers that question. It's not even a question. If you raise that question in a kind of ordinary economics course, it's like, what? I have no idea. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so we have to be. I think we have to say that a post-capitalist society can't just be a redistribution of wealth. We have to. It's got to come to terms with that, what we call the third question. What's the determining social forms and aim?
Okay. Ruth, Tom, did you want to add anything?
I'm tempted to want to add something on our way to socialist society. On the one hand, Moishe Postone in Time, Labor, and Social Domination identifies the treadmill effect. And on the other hand, I've been reading and studying Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. And at one point, Day quips, don't just do something, sit there. And I find the very act of getting off the treadmill and maybe going for a walk or reading a book or whatever the case may be has itself become a radical act within the framework of late capitalist society. I don't think the purpose would be to issue. I don't think the immediate purpose of false moves and philosophical and political consequences of the critique of political economy would be to issue in a 10-point program, so much as it would be to animate within the subject a different set of desires than the ones into which they've predominantly socialized, precisely about what the medieval philosophers called the transcendental, one good, beautiful, and true. And that if those are my dogs out there, if we really did have forms of inquiry that could recover vibrant, dynamic, full notions of the good. And, Charles Taylor's trying to work this out, and Alistair McIntyre's trying to work this out, and Hegel and Karl Marx are trying to work this out. But so I guess what I'm saying here is that I think the very act of stopping to think about how we're living within the social form is already itself a radical act. And it's an act in the way of what Murray and Schuler in the preface call conceptual healing. And I think if we had more conceptual healing, we'd know better what to do and how to live in the world. And we could achieve more conceptual healing if we got off the treadmill for a minute and engaged in more contemplative practices. I don't know whether I'm resonating with the larger conversation or not. But this means philosophy is a fundamentally good thing. Reading and studying and going for walks and etc. Everything that goes along with that as the counterpoint or the refutation or the negation of the treadmill effect. My workplace context is a university, and the students are already drones. they're expecting white collar jobs at six-figure salaries, but nevertheless, they're going to be workers, and they're already on the treadmill. They're carrying 18 hours of study, semester hours. Like they're studying 6 courses, they're working part-time. They do care about their social life. What they hardly have any time for at all is the moment to stop and think. Even I didn't know whether to go with Ignatius of Loyola or Paulo Freire here, but I've been talking with my own students about the contemplation of place, as St. Ignatius calls it. Like, just ask myself, where am I? What am I doing there? What good purpose am I serving? And I think if we had the habits of asking ourselves these sorts of questions, then many of the answers to how to go about living in a more humane and just and better society could begin to be answered. Because I don't think anybody has the answers right now. This is my disillusionment from having been in news and letters committees for a decade and then watching the organization explode, implode, and then having a pandemic and coming out of that. I don't think anybody has a very good program going on for the healing of the planet, for the future of society at this particular moment, and that the great need of the hour would be some kind of new Chautauqua, where we all got together in big groups to read false moves and philosophical and political implications of the critique of political economy.
When you say that, thinking as a teacher, that there are ways to bring into, our students are living in a tougher time than I was at their age. I felt more hope. We struggled about this and that, many struggles, but I think our students feel very powerless. And I think finding ways to, it's the old line that we have more power than we know. I do believe that's a fact. I do believe that small groups of people, have organized around issues persistently and made change visible. And sometimes becoming visible, it is enacted. And I think, the groundedness of wherever you are, like here we are, what were the lynchings in your town? Where were the labor struggles in your town? What Native Americans were massacred in your town? Here, wherever you are, you're going to have a history. And that history is generally not known to the people, even the history of your own institution, the exclusions that your own institution participated in, even despite its very ideals. And I think bringing the complexity of the world into our students' lives, so they're simple good bads, they don't cut it. But the undeniable evidence that people have changed this world, and that's, and young people have, in particular, have been pivotal in social movements in my lifetime and in the world. And I think that I don't know if that's exactly where you go in terms of getting out of the classroom into other forms of solidarity wherever you are. But my realization is wherever you are, there's going to be asylum seekers, there's going to be people trying to unionize, there's going to be people living in tents, and that opens up conversations about, now as a community, where can we go, and hopefully not have the really bad voices dominate those discussions. I don't know if that's socialism, but socialism to me is really rooted in things have to change. And I think more people feel that way. Things have to change. I think young people feel that way a lot. Because I think, we're in a very conservative part of the world, and people are really worried about the climate and the earth and where they're going to be in 20, 30 years when people like me are dead, And so I think that's a basis for talking about what are the ways in which things could change for the better.
I wanted to say a quick, if trivial to the present discussion point, just about McIntyre, Patrick, in response to you, but then a thought about this general question of how could a book like this, or how can philosophy in general inform organizing? I mean, just about McIntyre, I would just want to note that it's not like he's Mr. like, I hate emotivism. I mean, he doesn't like emotivism, but emotivism itself is tied to a particular concrete form of life, and that also, yes, capitalism is completely absent from that analysis, and it's the huge elephant that's not in the room. So I agree with you about that. But the whole analysis is to say, how do you wind up with emotivism as the dominant moral theory? What mistakes had to happen in order for that to be philosophically inevitable? And also, while we're at it, let's somehow, without talking about capitalism, do a certain kind of intellectual history of the world to show how the society has substantively changed such that emotivism is the kind of appropriate stance that you see within it. So just a word on and more of like why I thought of him with you guys, because there really is an effort, a deep effort, to get to where did you actually go wrong? And he tells a different story than you do, and a more limited one in some ways, right? We go wrong when we no longer have a functional concept of the human being. And how did that happen? That happened because people stopped all believing in the same God, or having a particular hierarchy, social hierarchy, that was enforcing it. He doesn't say a word about capitalism, but just that. But so that's that, believe it or not, that was the little thing. But I think a book like this, I mean, to me, universities are, the first thing you want to know about them is that they're sites of ideological reproduction. And that's what they're set up to do. And then the question is, if you're located in that kind of apparatus that has that as its purpose, can you do something other than that? Can you counter the very, and if you're someone who's in this realm of thinking that the fundamental categories are really decisive, can you do something within your classroom to counter the fundamental categories that your students are being inculcated in their thinking in their other classes? Right? So in almost all their classes, they're being taught that like there's just separate individuals and a collectivity is a bunch of individuals. Well, maybe in your classroom, they can learn about the concept of emergence, or, about a totality that doesn't reduce to individuals. So I kind of think in general that good philosophy, you need good philosophy, or you might even go further and say like good philosophy just is ideology critique. But certainly good philosophy is required for good ideology critique, right? So if you have a work that identifies fundamental mistakes in thinking that anchor entire problematic architectures, getting students to see that is really political in a really important way, even if, though I agree with the others, it's not programmatic, but it's definitely political.
Yeah, if I could say something, I haven't mentioned Simon Clark's book, Marx, Marginalism, and Modern Sociology. And, in terms of the root of that ideological function that you're talking about, Ruth. So he points out that in the 19th century, there was a revolution in social theory. There were sort of two. One was marginalism or neoclassical economics, and Marx's critique of political economy was the other. And obviously, the neoclassical dominated in so many ways. But he makes the further point that the horizon of neoclassical economics was really taken over by Weber and Parsons and sort of the early sociological thinkers. So that, and I think this is why we talk about social theory, to really say that I mean, his point is that horizon then, Tony, you were talking about a virus. The virus spread, if you will, to these other areas. So, I mean, the question I've pondered is, how do you, I mean, mainstream economics, the intellectual basis of neoclassical, it just seems to me so bankrupt, so corrupt. But what do you within the academic world? What do you do about that? Changing within North American economics departments, turning that ship around. I don't know. That doesn't seem that likely, and yet to sort of fight the ideological battle or the philosophical battle seems to me important. And Ruth, you just emphasized the reason why.
We see it in the social sciences too. I teach a course on the capitalist state, and I have students who've come in. It's mandatory in my department for students to take a course all about, I actually forget the exact title of it, but it's like they come in not so familiar with the concept of the state. Maybe if they've had some courses in comparative politics, the philosophers haven't heard the concept of a state ever. But the political scientists think about government, but they haven't heard about the state unless I made them read Aristotle, And so there's just a little tiny example of like, no, we want you to have a functioning concept of the state, even if, and as it happens, it's only the Marxists who are really serious about figuring out how it works relative to a capitalist economy. But we want you to, or I want them to read Aristotle, the ultimate, dead white guy, because I want them to be able to think about the structure and purpose of a constitution, of a regime type. I want them to think about that in their organizing. So it's not just like, oh, you're an asshole because you're rich. Oh, I'm sorry. We're on YouTube. But, I want them to be able to think about like class position, how does this work structurally? So I think these things that seem very abstruse. I mean, I'm talking metaphysics, like let's have a conversation about emergence. Is there a difference between a whole and some number of parts? Well, if you think there isn't, you're not going to understand. So you're certainly not going to understand what a collective bargaining unit is. You're not going to understand what a union is. You're not going to understand solidarity in the same kind of way. And the metaphysics sets you up to not understand it. What a shock. That's what ideology is. That's why universities are sites of ideological reproduction, but they can be sites to counter it. And I'm not saying this to convince any of you guys really, but more people in the audience to say like, some of these really crazy abstract is a whole something more than the parts have really political implications actually. And it's worth thinking about them for that reason. Just to get the synapses in the right way. You want the right architecture, as you guys say, for when you're thinking about what to do in the world.
Thank you. I mean, I think before Bintonian, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is we are in a dialectical trap, if you like. Because when I was listening to Tom, and I'd love to debate this with Tom, when he was talking about conceptual healing and the therapeutic element here, one of the things that strikes me is that contemplative moment is not dialectically linked with an active moment in practice or praxis. It's actually the contemplative moment becomes the moment, and the philosophical life leads us away from considerations with the very tools, using the very tools that could change the world. We tend to contemplate it, to think of the 11th thesis, and thereby miss a trick. And that slightly concerns me. But we are by our very nature, both of that life of the mind and seeking to turn it on its head, as Marx did with Hegel, and actually make it work. I also want to bring in a couple of comments from the audience. Jackie Belcher says, I kind of feels like false moves leads to corruption, and regardless of system, corruption will destroy a system and harm humans. And I suppose that's a very general comment morally. Emma C. Reiterman offers a question you might enjoy from the contemplative point of view, which is, like pairing wine with cheese, what is a fiction book you might read alongside false moves for a great experience? Now, while we contemplate that, I understand Tony wants to make a quick rejoinder.
Well, this is going back a couple of minutes ago to just the possibilities of a space to make the case against capitalism. And it just seems like capitalism does that job for us in a way. The basic legitimation of capitalism has always been that the market system is just a means, right? It's an efficient way to produce goods and services that can help meet people's ends. And so even if it's profit driven, and of course it's profit driven, the profits are just the proximate end, right? That ultimately we just want a system where people are after profits because that system as a whole is a means to get us to serve human ends. But of course, the way capitalism is developed, it's just becoming more and more difficult to make that case, right? And the environmental crisis just shows, well, if we had a system that really cared about human needs, we would be doing something about that, and yet we're not. And then, of course, just the whole financialization thing. It seems that the whole process of producing and distributing commodities now turns out to require increasing amounts of debt, and then debt on the debt, and then debt on the debt on the debt. And the main way of going from M to M prime is by creating all these claims to future profits, and then claims on the claims to future profits, and then claims on the claims to the claims on the claims on the claims to future profits. And so capitalism by itself is like teaching us that it's really not about serving our needs in any way that we can see. So I'm really more worried about the authoritarian threat, right, than I am about somehow we got to figure out how we can convince people that it's not legitimate. I think somebody has said that already. I mean, most of our students not the ones in the business schools maybe, and not all of them by any means, but a lot of students know, they don't have a choice here, right? It's a corrupt system. It's corrupt all the way down. They're going to have bullshit jobs. But they hope they get the well-paid bullshit jobs so they can have a somewhat decent sort of life. But nobody really believes the invisible hand, right? How many people really believe the invisible hand anymore? So I think capitalism in a way is already delegitimated itself and is doing that more every day. The problem is that there's the two sides of capitalism, right? There's the side that claims to freedom and equality, and then there's the side that says, well, the state's coercive powers are here to protect property rights and change the rules and stop the way history is being taught and stop the way the social sciences are being taught. And in Nebraska, your state, I just read that they're going to be eliminating tenure, or that there's a proposal in the legislature to eliminate tenure. In my old state, to the shame of Iowa, there are proposals about taking control over history courses on the high school level, right? So that they teach the sort of history what does the Declaration of Independence, how, their interpretation of it, the Star Spangled Banner, blah, 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 but not the history that Jeanne was talking about, right? How, my institution was built on land stolen from Indians and so on. So what's the point here? I think the bigger fear is capitalism mutating into the authoritarian version, right? China sort of as a prefiguration of what the successful capitalism of the future might look like. I worry about that more than trying to make our case that this is not a system that meets human needs. We can make that case, and a lot of people are going to buy it.
I wonder if I could make a response to the two questions, Paul, you just brought in. The one about a fictional book and the other about corruption. This is also a segue to next week, because one of the chapters in the Philosophical and Political Consequences book is on Charles Dickens' Hard Times. So that would be one I would suggest. And it's more than even corruption. I think the problem is nihilism. Really, that's the upshot. I think that Dickens is dealing with in Hard Times is the kind of profound nihilism. So I always remember reading Chris Arthur's essay, the Spectre of Capital, which is now in a book, a full-length book, and feeling like that was the most terrifying thing I'd ever read, because it really is. I mean, what is at the heart of this system is just this kind of yawning chasm, this void, and I just feel like I feel like over time we're feeling it. It's there was that there's a kind of falling rate of happiness that you can't be part of a system that's organized around something that's so empty, so vacuous as value and the valorization of value, and not feel it. I think so. I would say, yeah, corruption, but I think the corruption, the heart of the corruption, is really in the heart of capital, the kind of nihilism that really is at the heart of it.
Okay. Has anybody else got any recommendations for MC Reiterman on fiction book to accompany false moves? We're coming near the end, so if you want to briefly.
In terms of authoritarian capitalism, I thought Paul Lynch's book, Prophet Song, was a terrifying book of a possible future.
Okay.
Not quite. It corresponds to what happens if we don't pick up on the critique of capital that Jeanne and Patrick present. The road that we could be on.
Okay. Any other recommendations? I would recommend, actually, for both these books, an accompanying fiction would be Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, which I think is a devastating critique of the fetishization of the intellect. We've been going for nearly 2 hours, so we'll draw it to a close. First of all, just to say, anybody who bumped into this recording while looking for something to cheer them up, we're sorry, and there will be the usual numbers at the end of the broadcast. In the meantime, though, to use another cultural iconic reference, many of you will remember Batman from the 1960s, the Adam West Camp Batman series. And at the end of part 1 of a story, you were on the precipice, the cliff edge, they were going to die. Part 2 showed you how they escaped and where we went forward. Coincidentally, Patrick and Jeanne, who must be Batman fans, will be presenting their book to the same panel, the second book, next Friday. So we'll be looking at the philosophical and political consequences of a critique of political economy, recognizing capital. So for those of you who have enjoyed this, and it seems as if there are some of you who have, come back this time next week for another dose of our panel. But in the meantime, if you want to say good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
For being part.
Bye-bye.
Paul,
Thanks,
Tom, Ruth.
Thank you,
Tony.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for writing the book, you guys.
Yeah.
Okay, and have a good evening, or in some cases night, or in some cases morning. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay.